Hello everyone. As the director of Goethe-Institut Max Müller-Bhavan, Mumbai, I'm having the great pleasure of welcoming all of you present here, as well as our virtual audiences, to the first day of State of Nature Dialogues. This 3 days hybrid conference curated by Ravi Agarwal and Ranjit Hoskote is a discursive extension of our current exhibition, New Nature's Terrible Beauty is Born. On view in our gallery and the natural history section and lawns of the CSMVS Museum till mid-April. Questions of ecology and climate change are not only in the focus of the Goethe-Institut here in Mumbai, but are of increasing importance for our work on a regional and global level as well. To emphasize and elaborate on this, I'm very happy that we are having my colleague, Dr. Bertolt Franke, virtually with us today. Bertolt is the Regional Director, Goethe-Institut South Asia, and is based in New Delhi. Dear Bertolt, thanks for joining us, and please take over.
Everybody, namaste from New Delhi. Dear friends, partners, colleagues, dear Ravi, dear Ranjit, lieber Björn, lieber Amruta, colleague from Max Müller-Bhavan in Mumbai. Dear speakers and protagonists, dear participants in our online debate, State of the Nature Dialogues. Thank you very much for inviting me to a project whose topic in its breadth and political relevance concerns us all, but which one does not want to address with a few simple greeting phrases. For we all are addressed, we all are affected, we all are responsible. The titles of the individual panels for the next days already say that narratives, habitats, transformations, communities, livelihoods. So that's about everything. One can be curious about these talks, which obviously share a perspective with other important initiatives of this kind. In the face of the huge questions of our time and existence, we are relying more and more on a mix of insights from academic and practical disciplines, from philosophy to architecture, but above all, on further inspiration from the arts. In the end, it is the arts that are supposed to act as an authority of their own kind in all the confusion and complexity of our circumstances and show us the way as competent instances of understanding and explanation, out of which the bundle of this effort is supposed to become, let's say, to get an activist dynamic. I find this is an interesting phenomenon that we are encountering more and more at the biennales and festivals, the major exhibitions and the art fairs. And the more enthusiastic calls are being issued from there to the world, which is coming apart at the seams in so many dimensions. Ever more, the free spaces of the arts are becoming representatives, arenas, and parliaments of a confrontation with global issues. It's about saving the world, nothing less. I'm already excited, a little frightened about what our upcoming major event in Germany, the Documenta 15, will bring in this respect. We do this, and this is my thesis, we know in the same breath that the hoped for effect of such actions will not occur in the way we expected. Is it just me, or do we not all too often have the feeling that we have once again preached to the already convinced and converted, that once again we all knew what had to be done and said so, but that we can be sure that our efforts will once again fail to achieve the reality we are aiming at? Why do we do this? Why do we go into this spiral of frustration again and again, contenting ourselves and reassuring ourselves again and again with the dubious feeling of success of having said the right thing and been on the right side, but in the end having done really something to change what exists? My guess is we do not want to admit to ourselves that we don't dare enter the hard field of politics. Into that sphere where determined people are operating not with proper arguments and aesthetic surprises, like we do in this State of Nature series, but where power is fought for with heavy weapons. For that is politics at its core, power and the struggle for power. I hope I may be a little provocative here and ask whether it is not simply the case that this unpleasant, not at all sexy looking, rather dirty sphere, as which we have become accustomed to perceive politics, is simply too uncool and exhausting for us. We are helped in this by a label we gladly accept and bestow, a word not coincidentally from American usage, namely the title activist. Who is not an activist today, one might ask? And without wanting to offend anyone, certainly not any of the people present, isn't that self-awarded or third-party awarded title of activist all too often something like a cheap excuse that shifts the political duty that we all actually have into a general attribute of commitment, but which in the actual sense does not demand anything of us? Activists then quickly become everyone: artists, intellectuals, professors, authors, curators, directors of the Max Müller Bauern, whose achievement in the end may well consist solely in the fact that they are somehow on the right side. Why shouldn't instead, first of all, we all of them, artists, intellectuals, professors, authors, and curators, do their jobs as artists, intellectuals, professors, authors, and curators, and then, if they are not satisfied with the world as it is, getting involved in politics? Of course, that means sitting down in stuffy back rooms, in party meetings with people who are sometimes not very bright, fighting for votes, getting elected, first and foremost on a very modest, unglamorous level, and so on. Politics is not as exciting, inviting, and elegant as our event today, I know. And who wants to waste too much time and energy on it? But don't we all have to do our citizens' duty here, first and foremost, before we enjoy the privileges of our beautiful and brilliant cultural jobs? I say this for my part, towards the end of a long career in the cultural sector, also as a kind of skeptical resume addressed quite personally to myself. Perhaps the problem is just that almost everywhere we have given up our claim to a radical democracy, which is after all tasked with taking up these questions and pushing forward solutions in public discourse, and instead, frustrated and resignated, we are systematically overloading an area of art and culture that is perhaps fundamentally overburdened with the task of saving the endangered world. Please do not mistake me. Of course, the arts and debates like ours are directly political, and they should be. But they are thus only a part of a wider circle of the political, namely the public sphere, which also includes the media, education, press, etc. But if politics is ultimately decision about the interests and the fate of large numbers of people, then in the end, we will not be able to avoid entering the inner circle of the political, which is that nasty and never quite clean. On the contrary, mostly characterized by hard struggle and rarely by fair debate, entering the ugly sphere of power. And this sphere, according to my observation, is all too often avoided by us sensitive and distinguished thinking people from culture, art, and the intellectual world for very understandable reasons, preferring to linger in our so beautifully upholstered armchairs on and in front of the panels where we talk smart and deplore the fact that no one listens to us in the world of power, which we already so long have left to the careerists and cynics. Enough of that, I apologize. I did not intend in any way to spoil the fun, and above all, in no way to diminish the importance of this and many other debates. I simply wanted to point out for once the status of our action and the constant danger of misjudging and overestimating our efforts. For as important as it is to recognize that without insight and ideas, the world will not change. It is equally important to constantly self-relate our actions in the face of a real, harsh reality in which voices like ours tend to be ignored. That certainly doesn't make our beautiful event today any less valuable, but it should motivate us not to be satisfied with it. I look forward to the contributions and debates over the next 3 days, and of course, especially to my visit, hopefully next time, to Mumbai to enjoy the exhibition. Thank you to our partners. Thanks to the curators, to CSMVS Museum Mumbai, Harkat Studios, and the HKW in Berlin. And thank you for your patience and attention.
Becoming an activist meant that it wasn't making a statement about somebody else. It was, to me, making a statement about what really pained me when they cut a tree, when they put ash on the floodplains, where I saw the first wagtail, white wagtail, or when they wanted to change the ridge into a development zone. These were things that really pained me. And I acted just spontaneously and trying to stop it, and that's what made me an activist. But later on, you also realize the limits of activism, because activism, of course, is important, but it cannot be the only thing, because it has boundaries. And you need to open up, for a question like nature, many more doors and windows, many more ways of thinking, and many more people need to get involved in this, because it involves everybody. One thing I just realized during that time was the difference between the word environment, which we constantly use, and the word nature. Nature to me is a philosophical word. And environment is a technical word. You can make environmental norms, you can change environmental air by deciding what is the ppm in that, of pollution, etc., etc. But the word nature is something which every one of us interacts with without realizing it. It is part of everybody's life, but we're not aware of it or we don't acknowledge it. And I think you see it throughout histories of literature, of philosophy, of science, of humanities. Nature is the prime other, which is always there but never recognized. And today the big task I think we have in front of us is to acknowledge that relationship. And I call it a relationship because I think nature exists on its own. Without us, there will be nature. There is a world outside of us. But it appears to us only through our relationship with it. Hence, as Mukul Sharma would tell you, a Dalit's view of nature is not the view of nature of an urban elite. It's a completely different world. Or if you talk to the environmental justice people, the black people in the US, they will tell you the idea of nature is completely different than what somebody else in New York City might be having, because they don't live on Staten Island. So this is a very relative word, and the idea of nature is a philosophical idea. It's also a social idea. It's a political idea because it's determined by political relationships and social hierarchies. The last thing I want to add here is the idea of a multi-species world, which is the next step. When you acknowledge nature, none of our systems, including our legal systems, are based on acknowledging agency to anything else but the human agency. When we step out of the human agencies, we are completely at sea. We don't know how to behave. We don't know how to act on it. We don't know what that means. We don't know what other beings bring, what their languages are. How do we acknowledge it? We don't know. It's become so deeply anthropogenic, the way we have come to be. And why should we care? We care because now it is threatening our very survival. And I don't think that just by following the trajectory of what UN conferences do, what technologies do, is going to solve the problem. We have to break that trajectory. And this whole venture is an attempt to break that trajectory both externally as well as internally, because it is an internal question as well to each one of us, as well as a social and political question. And that's why it becomes so complicated to recover ourselves from what we've locked ourselves in. Hence, we need to look somewhere. We need to find new positions. This exhibition which I hope all of you will see, and those who are online will see at some point. I hope that it's basically a conversation between different artistic positions. The artists here, it's not a survey exhibition. Every artist working on these issues are not part of the small exhibition. But every one of these artists have a position. And by a position doesn't mean a position in a typical political sense. They have been asking these questions for a long time. They've been engaged with these questions with a degree of authenticity and struggle. So there are no answers. There are multitude of answers. And hence the formation of this conference, which Ranjit will talk to you about, is to explore the many threads which we have to unravel, and the many voices, not only the standard voices of environmental scientists or of political scientists, but the voices of so many people who make us think. Poets, authors, writers, all kinds of people who make us think and revisit what we have taken for granted. So with that, I hand it to Ranjit.
Thanks so much, Ravi. It's really a very special moment in the history of this project, State of Nature, that we're here today at the start of what seems to me to be a forum, really. And following from what Ilya said yesterday and what Bertolt just said, I think it is vital that we nurture the solidarities that we need to take forward our own resistance to the kinds of systems that threaten us as a species, that threaten other species, threaten the entire planet. And sometimes in more cynical moments, one thinks that the planet will be much better off without us and our constant interference in its workings. But that being said, I think what we've tried to achieve here also is to, in fact, take the environment back from expert culture and from forms of communication that can be alienating to people who really want to be part of this discussion, and to see if we can explore together these forms of discursive participatory citizenship, if you will. So to that end, the conference brings together poets, anthropologists, art historians, linguists, publishers, a whole range of participants who've all agreed to be with us and to share their experiences and insights, their memoirs of practice over the next 3 days. And I want to really express our gratitude to our speakers. For instance, we have the keynote that we will soon hear is by Michael Marder, who's a philosopher. We then go into the panel on narratives, where we have Latika Gupta, the art historian, who will draw out S. Anand, who is a publisher and a poet committed to the articulation of Dalit narratives and Dalit histories, Amitangshu Acharya, who has worked closely on, again, subaltern narratives concerning geography, concerning the lives of rivers, Anvita Abi, whose work has to do with the Andaman Islands, communities that have been pushed into vulnerability and marginalization, and what becomes of their language, their literature, and the way in which they bear witness to the world. Today's second panel, Habitats, is chaired by Pankaj Seksaria, who has a long history in environmental activism and in studying some of these locales and situations that are important to all of us who are speaking here. Rahul Ranjan, who is with us from Oslo, is currently doing his field work in Uttarakhand on the future of glaciers. And the talk we had yesterday by Ilya Troyanov, which was devoted to his novel Ice Tower, which is about a glaciologist, it's amazing to both of us how there are so many themes and questions and inquiries that resonate across these different participants. And in a sense, the way in which this conference has come together also speaks, I think, to our own biographies. Okwe and Wezor, who was a mentor to both of us, always used to say that exhibitions and all of these cultural enterprises really are a reflection of one's own intellectual biography. And so in a sense, it's really about these dialogues that have nourished us, and we want to really take this forward in terms of where these dialogues could go, how they could resonate in terms of publication, in terms of policy. And again, in the Habitats panel, we have Rahul, as I said. We also have Arun Kumar, HG, who's a participating artist in the exhibition, New Natures, but also has long had another life as an environmental activist, working with the endangered ecology of the Western Ghats, especially where he comes from, Shimoga. So once again, we have here a set of practices that are deeply embedded in the local, yet participating in planet-wide discourses and solidarities. And then we have Heather Davis, of course, who's done compelling work on these questions, who's going to join us from New York, and will also bring to the discussion her own experience of working with some of these species and planet-threatening questions. And I'm just going to, as I step down from here, I'm going to take with me both of these motifs. Ilya's yesterday, which was an invitation to optimism, to hope, to crafting strategies of survival, and how this can happen through unexpected diversities, the diversity of possibilities, of encounters. And the cautionary note sounded just now by Bertolt Franke, who reminded us that much of what we do might remain at the level of discourse unless it's allied to some fully real and engaged form of politics. So I will conclude this part of today's doings on that note, thinking of how one might still leave open the question of a productive politics that emerges from this, so that we are not only speaking to ourselves in an echo chamber. Incidentally, I don't believe we are, because each one of us is also addressing other circles, often working in other languages and across constituencies. I just want to say how moving it is to me to be speaking here in this library, where I first, many, many years ago, several decades ago, read Jürgen Habermas, and questions of the public sphere, of participation, of how one articulates one's concerns as a citizen. This was very, very important to me at a time when I was across the road at Elphinstone College, caught up with the Narmada Bachao Andolan and the Chipko movement. So in some sense, as with Ravi, these concerns have been with me since I was a student. This idea that one can somehow transcend one's limitations of class, milieu, language, location, and so forth, and link one's destinies to the destinies of people far away, of different levels of privilege, facing a different level of threat. And at the end of the day, I think this is what brings us together, not only expertise, not only academic preoccupation, but indeed the possibility that we can be empathetic subjects who can reach out to the vulnerability of the other. So these are the thoughts that I'm going to conclude with. And Bjorn, could we invite you up again to introduce us to Michael Marder, and we continue?
I'm having the pleasure now of welcoming our first keynote speaker of the conference, Michael Marder. The title of his talk is "Philosophy of Nature is Yet to Come!" exclamation mark. Michael Marder is research professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country, Vitoria-Gasteiz, in Spain. His writings span the fields of ecological theory, phenomenology, and political thought, and he's the author of numerous scientific articles and 18 monographs. Dear Michael, it is a great pleasure of having you with us today, and now the virtual floor is yours.
To me, the expression state of nature, which lends a title to the conference, rings with several connotations. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, has to do with a certain moment in early modern intellectual history of Europe, when Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau postulated a hypothetical mode of being human prior to the emergence of political communities. Whether it was conjectured to be a state of war, of all against all, or of idyllic peace in the absence of inequalities and exploitation, state of nature, taken in this sense, was an unconscious projection of the European thinkers themselves onto this prehistorical stage of human development. Now, the second association that comes to mind with the expression state of nature has to do with political customs, specifically in the United States, where the president delivers an annual State of the Union address. The next such address will take place less than a month from now on March 1st. This is usually a highly partisan assessment of the condition in which the country has been over the past year and of its prospects in the coming year. And so the interesting interplay between these two connotations with the state of nature is that while the first meaning of the state is static, unchangeable, atemporal, the reality of human beings prior to the dawn of history, the second sense is, on the contrary, dynamic. The state of X, the union or nature, changes, and it is these shifts that invite periodic assessments, panoramic overviews, and future-oriented prognostications. Nevertheless, before asking about nature in what state it is, we have to keep in mind one crucial development, and my lecture today will be dedicated to this development and to questioning it particularly. Essence, truth, and nature. These three concepts have been highly suspect to the point of being tabooed in continental philosophy circles since the second half of the 20th century. And nature is by far the most prominent of the three, particularly because its semantic and conceptual drift affects essence and truth alike. So essence may be understood as the inner nature of things, while truth can be defined as the accordance of a statement with their outer nature, or in a word, with reality. A lot rides then on the undercutting of nature, whether in its inner or outer aspects. When it erodes, its companion terms promptly follow suit. So before we ask in what state nature is, what the state of nature is, we have to really look into everything that the very notion of nature has undergone, particularly in the last half century. Rejecting this concept for a slew of reasons, including its atavistic connotations, hierarchical presuppositions, blindness to cultural and social constructions, and so on, we proudly declare our membership in the vanguard of contemporary criticism, liberated from the symbolic yoke of the past we'd much rather forget. Non-essentialism and post-truth are the badges of honor that go along with this membership that hinges upon rejecting the very concept of nature wholesale for these very reasons that I've cited just now. Now, the thesis that nature does not exist has found adherents of every stripe. The 19th century distinction between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften, between natural and human sciences, which had served as the cornerstone of the modern university system, has imploded, rendering both terms in the contrast meaningless. Roughly at the same time that the spirit, Geist, at the pinnacle of the humanities, has lost its credibility, the nature, Natur, at the base of the hard sciences has been divested of its significance. At the hands of natural scientists, nature dissolves into organic and inorganic chemical and molecular components, quantum mechanics and wave oscillations, condensed matter and thermodynamic processes. In the context of such dissolution, a unified notion of nature sounds like a specious abstraction. The scientists themselves contribute, the very scientists who study natural phenomena contribute to the divestment of the very concept of nature of its significance due to this kind of highly meticulous, highly divided division of labor that defines natural sciences. Along with nature, life too becomes an outdated concept after it has been reduced to protein structures or energy and signal transduction, enzyme catalysts and metabolic pathways, genes and their expressions. Having fallen victim to these and countless other reductions, the life of life sciences turns out to be all but dead, So just as the nature of natural sciences loses its significance, the life of life sciences becomes equivalent to death. Furthermore, the connection between life and nature should not be viewed as that between an organic part and the whole made up of organic as well as inorganic components. At its Latin etymological root, nature, natura, derives from nascere, to be born, or more precisely, from the verb's past participle, nato. Nature is natality, the movement of birthing, of a beginning of life that keeps rebeginning, and that perpetually in statu nascendi, which does not at all exclude death and dying, keeps giving rise to future life out of the remnants of the past, of rivers and mountains, plants and animals, stones and humans, bacteria and an oxygen-enriched atmosphere. So you can see already how a certain focus on the meaning of nature given to us in the very Latin word natura makes it not only a heritage of the past, but also a very future-oriented activity, not a collection of natural beings, but a future-oriented activity, the movement of birthing, of life's perpetual beginning and rebeginning. It is a movement. So nature's natura is a movement, the dance of coming to appearance, hatching or germinating, emerging from the birth canal or undergoing fission. It is also the movement of that which comes to appearance as an effect, the one or that which who is born. It is a movement as well of that from which the appearing comes, including the Aristotelian formal and material causes. And finally, the fourth moment of this movement, overall movement that is nature, is that it is the movement of that wherein that which appears emerges. The place, the context, the so-called environment in which the birth and the birthing occurs. Coming to appearance, for its part, is not covered by either classical or modern types of causality. Rather than merely phenomenal, it indicates that the movement of birthing is phenomenalizing, in fact, self-phenomenalizing, which is not quite the same as autopoietic. And as such, it both precedes and succeeds scientific explanation. It's the coming into the light, the appearing in the light, that the movement of birthing indicates, or of germination if we're talking about vegetal birth. And that is why I'm calling this movement phenomenalizing, self-phenomenalizing, while not forgetting its inherent connection to obscurity, to darkness, to the shadows. We'll be talking about this next as well. But for now, it's worth remembering that the objective devastation of nature, threatening beyond any given species the ostensibly inexhaustible stream of birthing indicated by the word itself, this objective devastation of nature finds its corollaries in nature's subjective and epistemic destruction. Whereas nature promises an ostensibly limitless outpouring of births, thanks to its ongoing hallmark activity of birthing, our contemporary philosophical, scientific, and technological outlooks are spellbound by death. I've already mentioned how decrying life as a metaphysical delusion, as atavistic as nature itself, biological sciences study life phenomena in terms of their substantive, biochemical or biophysical substratum, rendering them as good as dead. Analytic philosophy, aspiring to a scientific standing, inflicts the same fate on the life of the mind, laid out on the Procrustean bed of formal or symbolic logics. Non-analytic philosophy, heavily influenced, at least in the West, by Martin Heidegger and existentialism, is enthralled with death. Technology implements prevalent scientific and philosophical perspectives on a planetary scale, seeding death everywhere. Nature is accessible to our understanding as an a priori lifeless sum total or aggregate of natural things. So it is divested of its movement, of its activity of birthing, and instead nature is accessible to our understanding as a priori lifeless. The default condition of our thinking, if not of our being, is a death cleansed of life, the death which nonetheless passes for life itself, plus the cutting-edge research on how to delay aging and to satisfy the ever-growing demand for immortality, for the ultra-rich, of course. Now, the original articulation of nature's birthing not only feminizes the figure or the figuration of nature, but also zeroes in on a phase of life conventionally identified as its beginning, this beginning that perpetually begins anew. The beginning that is a birth is, however, highly peculiar. It coincides with the moment of coming to appearance, of emerging into the light, while leaving in the shadows life's covert development, incubation, or gestation that have been unfolding prior to that moment of birth as appearance in the light. The end of a life in death is a counterpart to its beginning at birth. But unlike the coming to appearance at or in the beginning, death is not a disappearance. The dead body, the corpse, remains, and moreover, these remains themselves undergo further changes, decomposing and later on becoming compost for the germination and nourishment of new life. The past participle form of nascere that yields natura starts making sense. In the first place, not in the light in which those born make their appearance, but in the darkness whence they emerge and whither they recede. The overall birthing that is nature does not exclude either dying or the dead, without whom the future-oriented trajectory of birth would not have been possible. Although at the subterranean level of being, death is not opposed to birth, the two moments have been treated as the extremes of a life, its beginning and end points. At the same time, death looms as the other of life itself. In fact, it is the sole notion that I know of that participates in two binary relations at once: death, birth, death, life. I don't know of any other binary term that participates in two binaries at the same time. In this case, death and birth, death and life. If death is the contrary of a beginning of life and of life as a whole, is that because life is always at its beginning, which is also an unsurpassable middle, born or reborn from itself as much as from its other? While saluting Hannah Arendt for the important work she undertook in this respect, we have no choice but to admit that natality is still poorly understood. Natality as the very definition of the activity of nature. Through an appreciation of its relation to life and to death, we might get a little closer to deciphering some of the meanings of nature itself. Now, of course, the thinking of nature did not commence with natura, which privileged the coming to appearance and birth. If we're thinking about ancient Greece, there, the thinking of nature started with a pre-Socratic conception of physis, that undeniably more vegetal than animal meant not only that out of which things grew, or of which in the last analysis they are constituted, but rather physis included the law or process of growth exemplified in all things. It is again an activity. Nature is not a collection in this ancient Greek conception, a collection of natural beings, but the activity here, not so much of birth and birthing, but of growth and growing. Physis as a noun obtained from the verb phuien, to grow, to appear. It is the same verb that gives rise to the Greek word for plant, phyton, a word with many other meanings, including child, descendant, or creature. Taken together, the growing, that out of which and that toward which things grow, amount to physis, amount to the Greek conception of nature. The ground of growth is not substantively different from the growing. It is made up of the traces of past growth decayed into the soil they fertilize. Nor is physis an ever-expanding polymorphous extension, but a swelling and contracting circle, a circle that has its cycles, its rhythms. It is not a constant quantitative increase, which we associate with a notion of growth, but rather a cyclical, rhythmic development, swelling and contracting. Growing, coming to appearance, living, these are all rooted in death, which is why all life is an afterlife, all growth is an aftergrowth. Self-grounded, physis is radically ungrounded, abyssal. Its thinking cannot be outmoded because what it holds in store and what it thereby invariably withholds in its variegated modes of coming to appearance is always yet to come. So whether understood as natura or as physis, the future-oriented movement of the past means that the being and the meaning of physis, of natura, of nature itself, is always yet to come, which is my thesis entitled in this talk. Now, if rooted in the past, physis belongs to the future, then it is an enigma, it is a secret. The pre-Socratic Heraclitus observed in fragment 123, and it's a very famous fragment, that nature loves to hide, physis cryptestai philae. To translate otherwise, the growing coming to appearance has a predilection to self-encryption, to concealment and non-appearance. Reformulated in this way, the unity of opposites, a theme winding through virtually all Heraclitean fragments, comes into a spotlight. Insofar as there's an order of things said to be natural, it is hidden, latent. Its successful elucidation, the successful explication of this order, conflates it with the appearing growing entities and therefore misses the mark. So the hiddenness of nature is not provisional, like the scientists make us believe. It is not a provisional hiding, but rather it is, again, an essential activity of nature itself. In fact, its predilection. Nature loves to hide. It is attracted to this sort of hiding and non-appearance, precisely of that which is growing and coming to appearance. In a similar vein, the Delphic maxim, know thyself, gnothis does not culminate in secure knowledge of the objective kind. Were it to have done so, it would have missed the very self to be known. Now, the paradoxical nature of Heraclitean nature may be attributable to a plethora of causes. For example, to the hunch that the ground for growth and appearing does not grow, but decays and withdraws from the world of appearances and visible forms. Right? And here, what would be really helpful is to think about physis, as the Greek for nature, as a gigantic plant. So if nature isn't understood vegetally in a plant manner, then of course a significant portion of the plant is hidden in the soil. The whole root structure is hidden, and not provisionally, but necessarily. And whatever appears above ground appears thanks to the remaining hiddenness of the root, right? This would be one possible explanation for the paradoxical nature of Heraclitean nature. Now, that said, what attracts me in these three Greek words of Heraclitus, nature loves to hide, is not so much the hiding, but the loving. It is impossible not to love this love. The love, philia, of nature puts it on a par with philosophy itself. Just as nature is the love of hiding, so philosophy is the love of wisdom. And maybe ironically, tongue-in-cheek, we could call nature philocryptia, by analogy with philosophia, philosophy. So what else can we glean from the nexus of philosophy and nature formed by philia, by love? Compare the darlings of philosophy and nature, the respective objects of their love, namely wisdom and concealment. At first glance, it seems that they are worlds apart. Wisdom discloses reality as it is, the essence and truth of being. Concealment, on the other hand, denies us such a disclosure. But a closer second look will come across a cardinal difference between knowledge, even the absolute knowledge, and wisdom. The former, knowledge, is pure eidetic light shed on every corner of existence. The latter, wisdom, is a highly elusive thing, slipping from everyone's grasp, as Plato's dialogues amply demonstrate. So wisdom is precisely not knowing, and the condition of possibility for wisdom is not knowing anything, except that knowing only that I don't know anything, which is what Socrates demonstrates for us. It follows that nature and philosophy share, besides love itself, the love for the fugacious, for what is difficult to track down and impossible to catch, for an object that is axiomatically absent because it is yet to come, right? The object in these cases being wisdom or the concealment into which nature always escapes. Friedrich Schelling, who, echoing or resonating with the deep impulses and vibrations of ancient thought, was exceptionally attuned to nature as an activity, was entirely correct in his assertion that, and I quote Schelling here, "To philosophize about nature means to create nature," unquote. Now, we should free this succinct statement of any and all idealist undertones. This is not a manifesto of the social construction of nature avant la lettre. In keeping with Schelling's logic and our own initial foray into the subject matter, nature is not created at will by the philosopher philosophizing about it. The philosopher who creates nature does not manipulate it as an object of theoretical understanding and practical construction, but rather joins, always belatedly, its own constitutive active force and the tradition of others who in the past endeavored to interpret this force, channeling the love of wisdom into physis that loves to hide. So there's a kind of confluence of these two loves in the very notion of philosophy of nature. What does all this mean? In our hurried, half-baked judgment, philosophy of nature is a thing of the past, part of a naive approach unaware of the intricate commingling of nature and culture, nature and artifice, nature and technique, the commingling that today is designated by this fashionable word, entanglement, right? We do not take either the time or the care necessary to distinguish a philosophy of nature capable once again, or for the first time, of relating to nature as such, from natural philosophy, Philosophia Naturalis, which uncritically carried out the activity of natural sciences before they became independent disciplines with well-defined domains of knowledge and their corresponding methodologies. In light of this indistinction between a philosophy of nature and natural philosophy, it would be better for philosophers to refrain from meddling with the scientific study of nature, lest they smuggle archaic metaphysical prejudices into the rigorous knowledge production and verification procedures of the natural sciences. If, on the contrary, there is anything we can learn from the physis of the pre-Socratics, hence from nature before its formalization in Aristotle's philosophy, it is that no one can justifiably lay claim to and conceptually correlate. No one can lay claim to nature and conceptually correlate. Nature is indomitable, despite our technologically substantiated illusions of total mastery and control over it, despite all the routines of cultivation, domestication, manipulation. It has never been kept at bay, firmly maintained in any theoretical or practical grasp. Nor, by the way, has philosophy been tamed enough to be transformed into intellectual property, regardless of the drive toward systematization, subjection to logical rules and procedures, methodological regularization, and so forth. Here, Schelling's assertion about nature, that to philosophize about it is to create it, finds a more general supplement in Gilles Deleuze's and Félix Guattari's suggestion that, in their words, the object of philosophy is to create concepts that are always new. Concepts are not waiting for us ready-made like heavenly bodies. There's no heaven for concepts. They must be invented, fabricated, or rather created, end quote. Nature and philosophy participate then in a synergy of creation instigated by the wild, untamed and untamable love at the heart of both. A philosophy of nature, which may or may not raise the question of nature's state, is yet to come, yet to be invented, to be created or co-created in the twinned birth of nature, including of birth as nature and of nature as birth and philosophy. Now, creation does not happen ex nihilo. Creation and birth, of course, and growth, none of this happens ex nihilo. It doesn't arise out of nothing. It requires the use of materials already at hand. What we must contend with in the multi-layered creative effort ahead that awaits anyone who wants to reinvent a philosophy of nature are at least three factors, three things. First, factors that in our present environmental, political, and economic conjuncture condition the creative endeavor, a kind of a historical horizon which necessarily informs the creation of a philosophy of nature, the creation of philosophy and of nature itself. Second, the selection process for the sorts of materials to be deployed and inheritances to be received. And third, the third conditioning factor is a malleable form that could grow from the selected materials themselves and not imposed upon them from the outside. Now, all 3 points, all 3 factors have to do, in fact, with limits to creation, limits that are historical, material, and formal, and limits that are not only prohibitive, but in fact enabling, that enable something to emerge within their ever-shifting confines and configurations. The historical limits are the most pressing ones. The assertion that philosophy of nature is yet to come, to be invented, needs to be contextualized within the actual exhaustion of ecosystems, the accelerating loss of biodiversity, the elemental mutations of water, air, and soil under a massive influence of industrial byproducts released into the environment. Nature is the power of perpetual rebirth, and philosophy is the promise of a future-oriented conceptual self-recreation. Nature and philosophy as expressions of a boundless love, of concealment, or of wisdom. Philosophy of nature is a unique synergic crossing of these two sorts of loves. All this must be vigilantly kept against the background of what I call finite finitude, hence non-renewability that is being unfurled right before our eyes, ears, noses, and minds in the 21st century. And this is the inherent paradox in my thesis. Philosophy of nature is yet to come because nature is always yet to come, and yet there is a definite threat at this current historical environmental conjuncture, global environmental conjuncture, that denies us the very hope of renewal, the very hope of an infinite that could be teased out of the finitude of life and existence. And this conflict, this inherent contradiction or paradox needs to be constantly kept in mind in all of our discussions of whatever it means to think and to engage with the state of nature. So a few more words on this rather tragic rift of our times before we open up for discussion, and I really very warmly welcome your participation and feedback on these ideas. The tragic rift of our times is the persistence of the ideological and for the most part unconscious conception of nature as a phoenix, which has either become or is in the process of becoming practically inoperable, incompatible with contemporary realities. For millennia now, and across different cultures, humanity has been interpreting the cyclical regeneration of nature as a sign of its infinite capacity for rebirth from the ashes of destruction. Hoping that this would continue indefinitely, we keep literally burning the world down while awaiting its resurgence. The same is true on a smaller scale for our attitudes to our own bodies that are supposed to bounce back and regenerate after having suffered horrific accidents, starvation, torture, and mutilation, or, less obviously, after having been subjected to the slow but steady influence of cancerogenic food additives, radioactive isotopes, or air and water pollution. So the idea is that the whole world and our own bodies and minds are like a phoenix that is meant to regenerate, to be reborn from the ashes of destruction. And this organizes unconsciously our future-oriented conception of nature. But all of this comes into question given the historical conditions of non-renewability in which we find ourselves today. Both singly and in groups, as consumers and corporations, states and energy companies, we continue to think and to act as if nature were safe and sound in the face of the irreparable devastation of biodiversity and the planet's fragile ecosystems, as if it and we ourselves were a miraculously resilient phoenix. No wonder that resilience is one of the ideological keywords of the day. Nonetheless, what is being and has been annihilated for some time now can no longer regerminate. It cannot be rejuvenated from the ashes, receiving a new lease on life from death. The ashes of our age are not fecund. They are not enriching the ground for future growth as nature was supposed to be doing and acting for millennia now. The ashes of our age are not fecund. They are the sterile signs of the death of death, not to be confused with immortality. These ashes, or these signs, include soil degradation and depletion, spent nuclear and non-biodegradable materials, desertification and the expansion of hypoxic areas in the oceans, the catastrophic melting of Arctic and Antarctic ice, the suffocating smog filling the atmosphere. Any future philosophy of nature must bear the realization of environmental finitude as a birthmark on the body of its thought. So committed to the love of what is yet to come, of what is hidden, of what will be reborn or what will regrow, any future philosophy of nature must bear the realization of this environmental finitude, non-renewability, as a birthmark on the body of its thought. The work is cut out for us. To be able to raise the question of the state of nature, we will have to delve into the rift between the already surpassed limits to regeneration on the one hand, and the economic and political, theological and secular ideologies that still make us believe in infinite regenerability on the other. And it is to be able to relate to the question of nature itself, not as an outdated concept or a thing of the past, but as a philosophy yet to come. I thank you very much for your attention and welcome questions and comments on this talk.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that inspiring and very critical approach to some of these questions that we've been wrestling with. And I'm very struck by the way in which you conclude, because this is, I think, the crisis that in many ways contours and defines the work of many of us who are gathered here for the forum, which is that on the one hand, we would like to commit ourselves to ideologies of hope and regeneration and solidarity. But on the other hand, our research, our work shows us very, very clearly what you defined as non-renewability. So really my question is, as one of several questions that I hope to put in play, what is our response to this dilemma? What is the ethic? What is the appropriate framework in which we can even begin to conceive of a future? If it seems to be so hemmed in, how would you respond to that crisis, which is not just philosophical for any of us, it also it directly affects our practice and our possibilities as citizens, as people dealing with these questions, as people hoping to create communities of practice.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Ranjit, for this wonderful question. Of course, the response, I hinted at it in my talk, and this is what I call finite finitude. We have to give up on the age-old idea that it is possible to tease out the infinite from finite beings. And this idea has been organizing the thinking of nature, not only nature, in the East and in the West, with philosophies of reincarnation, with even Platonic philosophy, where the finite beings are able to participate indirectly in the notion of immortality by leaving behind progeny, for instance, by replacing themselves with beings after their own kind. And that progeny, by the way, may be not only biological for Plato, but also cultural, or the issue of the mind, the child of the mind, which is what Socrates is most interested in. He is the midwife of ideas, as he himself defines himself. There is really a lot of seductiveness, as it were, in the approach that always finds the infinite in the finite, that doesn't give to death a final say. There is a kind of a movement, both in philosophies and in religious systems around the world, to deny the finality of death and to show that death itself can be actually a step in another direction of life, regeneration, and so on. Now, finite finitude, what I'm calling finite finitude, would learn to respect precisely beings in their unrepeatable singularity. Because the paradox inherent in the regeneration of these finite beings is the paradox of replaceability. On the one hand, the singularity of these beings is acknowledged, but on the other hand, it is denied because they can be easily replaced by other beings who are like them. And by the way, this organizes not only our thinking about biological progeny, but now more and more various alternative practices of energy that are supposed to be environmentally friendly, the so-called renewable energies, whereby, and I see this category as a really categorical mistake, because lumped into renewable sources of energy are solar, hydro, and other elemental energies, as I would call them, on the one hand, and on the other hand, whole crops of monocultures such as sugarcane or corn that are grown for no other reason but to burn them en masse, to distill biodiesel or ethanol out of them, and then to burn this as a source of energy. A practice that in its total environmental effect is actually much more harmful than burning even fossils or fossil sources of energy. So just to give a shorter response, the attitude that I'm inviting, that I'm welcoming, would be thinking through finite finitude, respecting beings in their precisely singularity that is not replaceable by others like them, and also adopting a certain lucid hopelessness, because very often hope can serve as a conservative force. It is because we hope that the whole world will regenerate after we reduce it to ashes that nothing changes, and we continue the practice of burning the world and burning ourselves, of course, who are not separate from it, in the hopes of this perennial regeneration. So in order for things to change, I think that we need to adopt the attitude of lucid hopelessness, not the hopelessness that is merely paralyzing, that means that we lower our hands and say there's nothing to be done, but rather the hopelessness that simply refuses to automatically give a nod of consent to the ongoing burning of the world and of ourselves, and that stops for a moment to consider the limits to this exercise, this millennial exercise of teasing out the infinite out of the finite.
Thank you for that response, Michael. It strikes me that if I've read your position correctly, there is a very powerful Stoic wisdom that informs your way of looking at these questions. There's a question from someone who's tuned in. What kind of challenge does the concept of the Anthropocene pose to the understanding of philosophy as envisioned by this Enlightenment tradition? It's a question grand in its scope, but I'm wondering if you would parse it to locate your particular take on these questions within the larger set of philosophical responses to our Anthropocene moment.
Yes, thank you for this question as well. Of course, the Anthropocene is a kind of an objective outcome of cumulative relation to nature, to the natural world that I have described here. And the name itself, for better or for worse, puts the human being, anthropos, at the heart of this geological age that we have presumably entered, the Anthropocene. There are, of course, many debates about the appropriateness of this name, given that it is not all humanity that bears equal responsibility for the current state of nature, as it were, but largely a part of Western humanity, as it were, the Western humanity from the rise of capital and the industrial age. Men obviously bear much more responsibility also than women. All of this has to be kept in mind. But what interests me in the notion of the Anthropocene, taking it on its surface, on the surface of what it names, is the Anthropocene as a symptom. What do we do when we name it with the name human, anthropos, this geological age? What meaning to the very notion of the human does it lend? And what happens, just to put it very briefly, is that all of a sudden we are looking into the layers of pollution that are accumulated in the Earth and in the Earth's atmosphere, the trace or the footprint left by generations upon generations of massive industrial production. We are looking at all of that, and we're using this pollution as a sort of mirror in which to recognize ourselves, to recognize a being presumably said to be human. And to me, this is the symptomatic moment of the Anthropocene, to look at a mirror of dirt, really, and not of good dirt, which gives rise to future life, but of non-decomposable, largely non-decomposable dirt, and to say, by looking into this mirror, this is what the meaning of the human is. To my mind, this sounds like the exact opposite of what happened in the 20th century, at least in the strands of existentialist philosophy, where the meaning of the human was an open question. To identify the human in any objective sense was seen as a crime. And so the existentialist approach to the human is precisely as a subject is an open question. So there is a shift here from a purely subjective relation to a being said to be human, anthropos, to a purely objective determination through layers of industrial pollution that serve as a mirror in which we apparently recognize ourselves, with a mix of disgust and pride. Because disgust, obviously, this is the kind of state to which we have brought the planet, or at least we who take responsibility for the state of affairs. And pride because, look, this is what has been accomplished. A species of human beings has had a planetary impact. So even though the moment of pride is largely repressed, it is there, I think, unconsciously and invisibly in many of the discourses surrounding the Anthropocene.
It's interesting that one of our historical horizons for this particular State of Nature project was the Club of Rome's report of the early 1970s, Limits to Growth, where it was exactly the non-renewability of the planetary plenum of resources that was very, very precisely spelt out, and even a framework of how long it was going to last. We are pretty much at the end of that period. So your reflections are so absolutely consonant with these questions. But also I was very struck, Michael, by what you just said, the shift in our understanding of human possibilities from the existentialist moment where all forms of perfectibility seemed possible through self-reflection and self-criticism, to what we now have, which is a very material and precise sense of our limitations and, if I might use a theologically loaded term, our guilt. So through this medium of theological reflection, I want to come around to this image, this myth that you've been working on, the myth of the phoenix across cultures. And I'm struck here by Joseph Campbell's idea of myths to live by, that there has to be this level of commitment to something seemingly larger than ourselves that gives purpose and direction and shape to our lives. So if we are now in this moment of disgust and pride and uncertainty, what sort of myths do we live by within the framework of what you characterize as finite finitudes? What would be the mythic counterpoint to the phoenix that might give our lives this kind of inner meaning and possibility of integration?
Yes, that's again a wonderful question, Ranjit. Thank you so much. In the larger project I'm working on now, I'm calling the influence, the unconscious and largely subterranean influence of the myth of the phoenix on our thinking about nature, about ourselves and the world, the phoenix complex. So it is not just a single myth, but it is a whole complex that emerges on its basis, organizing our effective intellectual, philosophical, economic, and other approaches to the world. Now, as the very term complex indicates, things are never simple. They are rather complex. And the version of the myth of the phoenix that has reached us and that is automatically associated with this mythical figure is one of hundreds, literally hundreds of different versions of the myth that circulated in antiquity. And it is not by chance, I think, that the version that comes to mind immediately when we hear the term phoenix is the one where the bird, the aging bird, catches fire, burns to ashes, and immediately regenerates from them. Because here we find the most telling symptoms of the phoenix complex, disgust with matter and specifically with material decay. So matter is almost eliminated by the power of fire, reduced to the bare minimum of ashes, and also impatience with and allergy to time, because it takes time for things to develop, to grow, but also to decay and to regenerate, to be nourished in this subterranean manner by products of past life. And so the resurrection of the phoenix is instantaneous because of that. However, there are other lesser known versions of the myth that carry the resources that might be useful for this particular moment in time in which we find ourselves. Versions of the myth of the phoenix where regeneration is not at all instantaneous, where the bird actually is given the time to decay, and from the products of that decay, a new life emerges through what was known at the time as spontaneous generation, a kind of worm that emerges on the body of the dead bird and gradually metamorphosing is transformed into another perfect phoenix. So I think that what I'm calling the phoenix complex already carries within itself the tools necessary for overcoming it from within. And I think this kind of immanent criticism, at least to my mind, is the most helpful and the most effective way of proceeding, instead of simply rejecting this millennia-long tradition that spans different cultures. And in fact, the myth of the phoenix does not emerge in ancient Greece; it emerges in ancient Egypt. So it's exported out of Egypt into Greece with the name of the bird changed from the Egyptian Benu to the Greek phoenix. So phoenix is a transcription of the Egyptian Benu. It's a cross-cultural kind of complex and myth, and it already with its complexity and the very fine texture of contributions and influences includes all the necessary resources for overcoming this very predicament and thinking about the condition of finite finitude that I'm proposing here.
Is this working? Yeah. Michael, thank you for that very textured and precise response, and also for reminding us that myths become visible and available to us in kind of prepackaged ways, and that we need to look beyond the surface to see what other crises and dilemmas they might encode. So thank you very much for pointing out that resource. Another question that I'd pose to you now has to do with the nature of your own practice and where you seek grounds of solidarity, because our forum here is also working on the bridge between the arts, the humanities, the sciences, technology, activism, and so on. And you and I, of course, met in the context of what is still called the visual arts, but clearly embraces much more than only strictly a kind of Beaux-Arts context. And you've worked closely over the years with artists, you've engaged with their work. I'm thinking of Agnès Tondeur here, for instance. So could I draw you out on this a little, about how you look to artistic practice, for instance, as a ground for discussion, for finding affinities, and for also seeking collaborations?
Yes, definitely. I have, over the years, conducted a number of collaborations with artists, both visual artists and sound artists, composers, for instance, as well. My idea of this collaboration, which I share with my collaborators from the art world, is not that art somehow simply illustrates abstract philosophical points and that philosophy simply provides an exegesis or an explanation of certain artworks, but it is a much more intimate relation of collaboration where each mode of thinking and practicing constantly responds and being responded to by the other. So it's an ongoing dialogue, and it is in this dialogic development that the collaboration itself arises. Probably I have to give more precise examples because the subject matter about which the collaboration is determines largely the outcomes of the collaboration. We are not imposing a pre-existing method onto the matters under discussion, under consideration, but are seeking the clues from the matters under consideration themselves. So for me, this is an important tenet of the phenomenological method, which I follow in virtually all of my investigations. A more concrete example is of an ongoing collaboration with Agnès Tondeur. We actually have a number of ongoing collaborations. The Chernobyl Herbarium, the first project we realized together, is still a developing project with a new textual fragment and a new photogram by Agnès Tondeur emerging every year to commemorate the Chernobyl disaster. But the more recent collaborative effort has to do with the envisioning of vegetality as the very being of plants. And what we are trying to do is to allow plants themselves to point the way for our philosophical and artistic practice, for the engagement of philosophy and art through the plants themselves. So the idea is to let the project grow and germinate, first of all, from the seed and grow as a plant would with different meristems or possible directions for thinking and artistic creation indicated by the material at hand, by the way that plants themselves live and grow and develop. So that is to say that I don't have a preset, ready-made answer to a cookie cutter recipe, as it were, for artistic philosophical collaboration, but I think each of them is very singular, very context dependent, and very much organized by and directed even by the matters about which the collaboration is. It draws both myself and the artists with whom I collaborate toward itself and dictates, as it were, our positions in this manner.
Thank you so much, Michael. And I've always been fascinated by the shape of your thought, because you've always resisted the great certitudes, the great system-building approaches. And even in the course of this talk today, when I think about the approaches you're underlining, meuetics, midwifery, or heuristics, seeking out through trial and error and listening to the material at hand, or the dialogic approach, I'm just interested in your philosophical journey and how it is that you reach back to, it's a journey that I think was important to a number of people, but in your work it shines forth, really. It's a kind of a return to a pre-Socratic ethos. It's a return to the agora. This is really a biographical question. Could I ask you to indulge us a little, talk about your as a philosopher?
Yes, definitely. And you are right, Ranjit, that the pre-Socratic mode of thinking is very close to me, and especially what I would call elemental thinking, thinking with not only about, but with the elements, the four classical ones, water, fire, air, earth, they're highly significant to me. Another aspect of my, if you will, of my method of thinking is that I reject specifically abstract modes of thought, not only system building, but abstract thinking that disfigures that which is being thought or that which we are thinking about. So for me, it is important to always begin with a figure of thought. My thinking is in a way figurative, and this is not, it has been often mistaken for a kind of metaphoric way of thinking. Of course, metaphor is important, but more than a metaphor, it is a figure of thought that is important to me, because without figuration, without a figure, and the figure is obviously not static, figures are dynamic, and plants are the most dynamic, growing, metamorphosing, decaying figures of thought I know of, and that is why they keep attracting me to themselves. I think that for me, philosophy has always been about a way of living, not only translating the world into abstract systems of thought, but really a way of living which engages with living figures, and that are prevalent throughout my work, from plants to fire and dust and the dump more recently as well. This is a kind of, I guess you could say, a practical mindset that philosophy is not an abstract program for thinking, but rather it is the way that we are, the philosophical concepts are also decaying into the soil of culture and largely imperceptibly organizing our relation to the world, even the way our industries are acting, what kind of materials are being produced, because I see that the production of non-biodegradable, non-decomposable materials such as plastics or nuclear waste is a realization, a perverse realization of old metaphysical dreams of immutable being. So because these dreams can be realized now materially, they have been transformed into environmental nightmares, because precisely the ideal of philosophical metaphysical being that is not generated, does not pass away, stays forever the same, is the absolute nightmare in terms of planetary metabolisms, in terms of the way that ecosystems function and precisely regenerate and renew themselves. I think that if you're asking for a more personal kind of reason for the attachment to particular figures of thought, in my case, plants have been such important figures probably because of my constant displacements and almost exiles. I have written about this a little bit in a book co-authored with Lucy Rigaray, Through Vegetal Being, where the idea is that I felt that while I was displaced, I left the places where I lived and which were dear to me. The plants that were there remained, and therefore they became the mnemonic centers for my psychic life, for organizing my own identity. And then that was translated into a philosophical practice, a philosophical approach and predilection to plant thinking and to plants. Now, I can interpret this only in retrospect. This was not at all organizing the development of plant thinking at the time when I was elaborating it. But in retrospect, I can tell that this was an important component in my philosophical practice in relation to plants, for instance. Yeah.
Michael, thank you so much for talking to us about these also I respond really warmly to that, the idea of how the symbols that form psychic, so focal points in your psychic life, then also are elaborated into larger discourse and that is more inclusive. It's interesting that our speaker yesterday, Ilya Troyanov, also is the product of multiple diaspora, from Bulgaria to Germany to Kenya and so on. And you yourself beginning with Russia and then moving out westwards. It just is intriguing how the figure of the nomad, the figure of someone who is between memory and the creation of a future through what you so beautifully characterize as a kind of lucid hopelessness, seems to now be a kind of exemplar for what lies before us. Also, as you were speaking, I was reminded of a line from one of my favorite poets, William Empson, who says, slowly the poison the whole bloodstream fills, the waste remains and kills. And I really want, on behalf of all of us, our on-site and online audience, really want to thank you for having reflected in such a rich and expressive as well as provocative way on these questions. And you've left us with questions, and I do hope you'll come back into the discussions of the next few days. But really, I would say that these themes that you've elaborated will remain with us through the conversations of today and the next 2 days. So on behalf of all of us, I'd really like to thank you, Michael, for being with us and for being so generous with sharing your ideas.
Thank you very much, Ranjit. It's a pleasure for me, and I wish all of you a wonderful and fecund conference. And I'm very happy that I have been able to contribute to it in this modest way. Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll come back in about half an hour's time. Since everybody is in a different time zone, I'm just going to say 30 minutes from now. And Michael, I know you have many claims on your time and attention, but you have the schedule. So if you're with us for any of the sessions, that would be marvelous. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ranjit. Thank you.